Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stickler for the Details. My name is Alan Dickerson, known in some wargaming circles as Stickler, and it's been a while since I've recorded an episode, um, but I'm doing this because I recently came across a YouTube video by our very own Mark Ruggiero, who, as you may know, is battling terminal cancer. And for the last year plus, since he has been diagnosed with terminal cancer, he has just been a force on on YouTube and in the wargaming community, and has been a great inspiration to a lot of people and a personal inspiration to me. So upon hearing that he did a top 10 list of his favorite war games during a certain pivotal time period in history, I kind of took it as a challenge to do likewise and talk about my earliest involvement in the history uh, of wargaming. And so I'm kind of doing this as a solidarity move from Mark. So keep fighting, brother. We're all here behind you. All right. So, anyway, I'm going to also do a top 10 list, and my years are going to be 1970 to 1983 as well. And one is because I started my war game career around 1974, and one of the games that I'm going to put on this list was published in 1970, I believe. So I'm going to go back to 1970, even though that predates my involvement with wargaming by about 4 years. The tail end, 1983, I'm gonna stay with that too, and but not maybe for the same reason Mark chose 1983. In 1982 or 83, um, I began to drift away from the hobby. I was going to college, and so all of my activities and interests and things like that really began to change a lot. And so I wasn't meeting every day with my high school buddies who were my first wargaming buddies and friends for life and still are. But I wasn't meeting with them all the time. So just for lack of opponents, lack of interest also, I drifted away from the hobby and would not return until 2014, about 10 years ago. And that's kind of another story uh, in and of itself. But anyway, 1983, I guess, makes a really good um, back end and gating factor for this list. Um, so let's go back to the start. I began my career, if you want to call it that, in wargaming in 1974, and I was a young lad living in Pennsylvania, and I was in middle school, and for whatever reason, I fell in with this group of people who were, kind of the geeky non-jock kids, and I'm pretty sure that they ended up becoming D&Ders. Um, but one of them introduced me to the concept of war games, and he brought one to school one day and kind of let me look at the counters and the maps and all of that, and it all looked kind of interesting. Um, but I wouldn't. I would never game with them. And the following summer, uh, we piled into a car and drove west from Pennsylvania to California, so I would never even see them again. But the important thing was that the seed was sown, and I had this interest in these games. And once we got to Los Angeles, I remember that Christmas, I got my first two war games, and they were both Avalon Hill titles. One was 1776, and the other was Blitzkrieg. And so, I got those games, and I got interested in those, and I didn't have any opponents at the time, and so, I kind of started my career solo. Um, and eventually, I would get Africa Core and Bulge 65, and I kind of became an Avalon Hill company man. And then I ended up at a um, Jesuit college prep school called Loyola in Los Angeles. And mm, excuse me, um, when I went there in my sophomore year in high school, um, I met my high school wargaming buddies, and they kind of turned me on to SPI games, got me to completely switch over to that. And yeah, so we gamed extensively throughout our high school career, and that kind of is what populates most of this list. Were games that we had on steady rotation, I guess you would call it, throughout our years in high school. So anyway, in no particular order, this is not a top 10 countdown or a ranking. This is just 10 of the games that we played the most and that we enjoyed the most during my high school years. And here we go. So we're going to start here with Terrible Swift Sword. But before we do that, I do want to go on another small rant and complain that while setting up for this, I decided to use Board Game Geek as kind of the preview mode for the boxes. And while setting this up was appalled to find that most of the games that I selected, whenever I looked them up, I would be confronted with a box cover that was just not the original. It was either from a second edition or a third edition, or after the game had changed owners, and it just it's one of the things that ticks me off about BGG is that they're for a grognard, they're just not serious. They never know what they're talking about. They never quite get the details right. And although it's a good site for doing just basic research on a title you know nothing about that you just heard about, it's good for finding information like that. It's good for having an online collection that you can kind of go to and curate and everything like that. But just in terms of the editorial and stuff like that, I would much rather go to Consum World forums. But anyway, I digress. Terrible Swift Sword. This is a wonderful game which came out in 1976, and it was the first um, Civil War grand tactical regimental level game, and would spawn a whole family of other games within the system, and eventually around 1999 uh, would end up at GMT, where they would substantially change the system and improve it, I might add, and go on to form the focus of most of my wargaming since I returned to the hobby in 2014. So when this came out, it was huge. Most of us had never played anything on 3 maps or 4, um, even though War in Europe was very popular, and so was Drang Nakosten and Unentschieden. Those strategic level um, World War II games were also popular, but Terrible Swift Sword and soon after Wellington's Victory were the first tactical level 19th century warfare systems um, to get this kind of a treatment. You could also get La Bataille de la Moscowa, but that was at a really, really rudimentary stage and wouldn't get to the lofty level that it now enjoys for mm, several titles to come. But anyway, Terrible Swift Sword was a game that we set up and played the entire campaign. And one of my uh, one of my toughest beats in my wargaming career came when um, I ended up trying to get a head start with the Union on building breastworks on Cemetery Hill, only to have my opponent, who was playing, I think, early, walk up to my line of breastworks and just proceed to roll a whole bunch of route results for my units, and he just decimated the entire Cemetery Hill line, in time for them to take that hill by dusk of the first day. So that was one of my worst moments, I suppose, in wargaming. But again, just great gaming, and the overall effect that Terrible Swift Sword, or the influence that it had on gaming since then, cannot be underestimated. So, of course, this would end up on this list. Next one I'll go to is Air Force, and also its companion, Dauntless, which was the Pacific version of it. Air Force Dauntless was the very first game I played that was single aircraft tactical, basically dogfighting. Um, it started out with a battle line, and then was let's see was bought up by Avalon Hill, and they really did a butcher's job of kind of trying to repackage the system. But let me go back. Anyway, Air Force was a game that used the at the time in vogue plotting system, where for each of your aircraft you would plot your move ahead of time and simultaneously with your opponent. And then once everybody was done, you would make the moves, and then after that, then you would determine who would have a chance at a gunnery shot. And then you would do all of those, and then repeat the process again and again. So it was very, very rudimentary, although I guess it would probably be kind of medium complex at the time. Now it's seen as a pretty rudimentary system, and there are several much more detailed tactical combat systems available, um, but for all of their detail, they are just not as fun to play. I normally don't fall in. among the school of thought that I would rather have a breezy and fast game. I usually like games that are really meaty and that you have to really dive into and that take a long time to play. But for this particular subject, I prefer this. Um, yeah. So Air Force and Dauntless were the um, European and Pacific versions of the same system. And then there was also a Air Force Dauntless expansion kit that followed on that added a lot of additional aircraft to the German, American, British, and Japanese um, arsenals, but also added Italians, French, Russian, and other aircraft to the mix. So by the time Air Force Dauntless expansion kit came out, you had pretty much the entire plane set that anybody even knew of these aircraft, and it was a lot of fun um, putting them on a map and having at it. It's a great dogfight game, but it did not do well in terms of simulating um, the bomber war of um, ground strikes or shipping strikes, just because of uh, the way the system was designed, um, and the the supposition that the basic fire tables were built on were that of the effectiveness of a pilot directed aircraft firing its weaponry. There, you could assume that, unless your plane was very, very weakly armored and you were way, way, way out of distance and your angle of attack was all wrong, unless probably all three of those were true, you were going to be able to do some damage with just about every shot. But not so when you talk about tail gunners, flex gunners, um, gunners aboard ships. They they had a completely different set of circumstances, but they used the same tables, and so they also got the benefit that they were pretty much going to be able to hit something, and that really, really skewed the results. I took a pass at trying to create some alternate rules for um, all of the non-pilot directed gunfire, and I tested it with a fellow of mine, and it worked out pretty well. It added a bit of wristage and die rolls and things like that to it, but it I think it better simulated the disparity between fixed forward pilot directed gunnery and all other types of gunnery. So anyway, this one was a mainstay um, of my early career. Next one we'll go to Kingmaker, and this is probably one of the few area movement and one of the few card driven games that has ever held my interest longer than 5 minutes. Um, it is a combination of a war game and a kind of power politics type of game. Um, and it is set in the 15th century War of the Roses in England. And it is just a lot of fun. It really is. It's built around a lot of just random chaotic events, and the players up to, maybe I guess 6, somewhere between 4 and 6 is, I think, ideal, although you can have more or fewer. Um, each of the players in a game controls a faction of nobles and their forces. And also, they get additional forces and influence and control of towns that are conferred through the titles that are bestowed to them, to the offices in parliament that they may control, to the bishops and archbishops that they may have in their pocket, and just other cards with that confer mercenaries and things like that, and also control of ships. And you basically have all these factions kind of on a map of England, and you're moving them around with the idea that you want to capture a royal heir, make sure that that heir is first in succession in either the House of York or the House of Lancaster. And if your rivals maybe control someone who is farther up the succession line, then you're going to want to uh, capture that royal heir for yourself, and or see that they uh, see the business end of a guillotine or something like that. And so you do this under the backdrop of plagues happening in cities that you may be traveling through, um, embassy calls. Whoever controls the king, is constantly called around to do politicking and all those things that the king is wont to do. And of course, you got to send your uh, entourage with him to protect him and keep him from being captured. But of course, that might take you away from your power base. You may control a lot of towns or something like that, and a lot of power in the north of England, and then the uh, the embassy visit is on the south coast near Southampton, and so you've got to go, or risk losing your control of the king or the royal heir. And it's just a lot of freewheeling, a lot of double dealing and backstabbing and uh, things like that. And eventually, you want to find yourself um, in Parliament taking votes on who controls different offices, and eventually you want to be able to crown yourself sole king of England and win the game that way. It's a it's a crazy evening full of fun, and probably the best way that you can lose a good friendship is by playing a game of Kingmaker. So this was one that you know was in steady rotation, and anytime anybody wants to play Kingmaker, I'm in. So that was a fun one. Then there's Air War. So this game is also a single aircraft tactical, but in the modern era, air game, starting with the Korean jet era and all the way through what was then at the time the third generation of aircraft. So that would be for the Americans, your F-15s, 16s, and 18s, and for the Russians, your MiG 23s, MiG 29s, those sort of thing. Those were, and also the MiG 25 was at that time, thought to be a potential world beater, and it wasn't until um, around the time that this came out that people began to discover that maybe the MiG 25 Foxbat wasn't really the be all end all of interceptor aircraft. But anyway, the thing about this game was at the time, it was the most complex war game on any subject anywhere. The rule book was, I think, upwards of 50 to 60 pages, and it was just really, really, really difficult to learn all of the concepts in order to play. Everything was new. There was not another game that was like it that you could say, "Oh yeah, well it kind of works like this." And I remember when it came out, one of my high school buddies was really, really into a lot of modern stuff, while most of us were, you know, into World War II or maybe Napoleonics or the Civil War or something like that, and we didn't really dabble that much in modern, but he was a big fan of it. And so he got a copy as soon as it came out, and he set to work on me to get me to learn it. And I just kind of balked at it because it just looked really complex. And so, of course, us being in high school, he resorted to various challenges of my manhood to cajole me into learning it. And so, of course, you know, being in high school, I took him up on it, and I it took me three different read throughs of the rules to get through it to where I've thought I could attempt to play. I bounced twice, like really hard off of it, and then he would start cajoling me again. And finally, on the third attempt, I got it, and we played. And then we dragged some other of our buddies into it. And by the time, maybe another month was over, this game got into heavy rotation. And one of the things that we found was, despite its complexity and despite how difficult it was to learn how to uh, manage these maneuver displays and all these things and do all these maneuvers, after you got it down, it really played smoothly. And, we could get into a game of air war and, play a 2-on-2 or 4-on-4 about as easily as we could do the same thing with Air Force Dauntless in World War II. It really, really played smoothly, even with, like missiles in the air and, you know, gaining and breaking locks and chaff and other countermeasures all over it. Still, once you understood the basic concepts, it flowed really, really well. Later, we would discover that it did have a couple of issues with the physics, and my favorite example of that was the lateral rudder roll maneuver that you could do, where you could get your aircraft to go 60 degrees relative to where its nose was pointing, and you could basically do that indefinitely if you wanted to, which, of course, no, that's not exactly how it works in real life. And then there were things with bombs. They failed to properly factor in, the fact that a bomb that drops from height has an initial momentum going forward, so it's going to move forward as it moves down, and you don't have to actually get directly above the target to be able to bomb it, which was also a problem with Air Force Dauntless. So it wasn't just air war. But anyway, that this game was a rollicking, rollicking bit of fun, and I still have my copy, although I think it's all three or three out of four of the corners of it are like blown out. So it's just a testament to how often we brought this one out. And this is a game that actually I did not play during this time frame, but didn't discover until I got back into wargaming. But I include it just because it was a part of this era, and because I think that it's one of the best games of the entire 20th century. It's just wonderful. S. Craig Taylor's Flat Top. And this one started as a battle line game, and then Avalon Hill bought it, and they they actually did a good job with it. They didn't uh, destroy it like they did with Air Force Dauntless or another game or Terrible Swift Sword going forward. Oh, no, no, no. That was TSR that mutilated Terrible Swift Sword. So anyway, Flat Top is a operational uh, game of the carrier wars throughout World War II, and it's really really interesting in that it's a double blind system where um, both players manage their forces, their ships, and also the aircraft that fly off of those ships. Um, you manage them on off-board, off-map displays, and the only counters that you put on the shared map board are those that both players know about. And it's it's incredibly tense. And you're sending out searches with your search aircraft, and you're trying to discover the enemy in time so that you'll get the first chance to launch a strike that could, sink the enemy carrier. Um, and of course, your enemy is doing the same, trying to locate you. Then, of course, you have the situations where um, you have to manage ships that or you have to manage aircraft that may be landing on your carrier, and then you have to refuel them, rearm them, and not get caught flat-footed as the Japanese famously were at Midway, where they were in between strikes or addled with indecision about whether or not they should launch a strike. And that was the time when the Dauntless dive bombers appeared uh, overhead and just decimated the Japanese fleet. So you get the same sort of drama and and craziness in a game of flat top. Um, I have played this game primarily through the Vassal module. I have a buddy who lives in Michigan, and we had like a standing Saturday game for a number of years. And flat top was usually the game we would play, and then once we got done with the game, we wanted to take a breather. We might go and play some Air Force Dauntless or try something, completely different that we could agree on. But invariably, we would go back and we would play flat top again and again and again. So during the time, we played probably half of the scenarios that are in the box, and we also played some of the expansion scenarios that appeared in the Avalon Hill General. And so we played the Wake Island scenario from the early war, and we also twice played Midway. Um, and that the first time we played Midway was probably the number one gaming experience in my entire career. There might be a couple that I might put up with that, but this was great. I played the Japanese, and I spent the entire first day just trying mightily not to be detected by the Americans because I knew that the Japanese they're at a big disadvantage in terms of their search capabilities. And although they do have some better aircraft in certain narrow envelopes, just overall, the US have a big advantage in just about everything else. And so just being able to get close enough to Midway to launch a telling strike without getting then tattooed by the waiting hidden US Navy is just it's incredibly difficult. And I remember, going through that first day, and there were a number of times where search aircraft like flew directly over uh, one of my fleets. And just as luck would have it, the search would be unsuccessful. And, of course, we're calling this out, and I would have to like act like maybe I was looking for something or maybe I wasn't. And, of course, once he flew right over that, my heart is in my throat. And then he rolls the die and rolls a 6, and so there's nothing detected. So I would just, really quickly say, nope, nothing there, to kind of throw him off the scent of maybe trying that search in the next turn. But yeah, flat top was great. But anyway, the the highlight of that was that I went the entire first day almost until sundown without detection. And then when he did detect me, it was like right around sundown, and I was able to duck into a cloud bank. And so for the night to come, I was still undetected. And I got in a minor strike that did a little bit of damage, but not a lot. But during the night, the Japanese have several big battleships with these heavy guns that I was able to sneak in, and I caught at 3 in the morning. I parked the ships off of Midway and just leveled it. And I also caught him refueling all his Catalinas and things like that. And I launched this barrage. And, not only was it a huge barrage, from these uh, Yamato class battleships, I got, all kinds of plus modifiers and everything. And I rolled a 6, so I got to double the damage I was doing. And then, of course, because he had aircraft being refueled on the tarmac, I think it doubled it again or something like that. But when the smoke cleared, and there was a lot of it, Midway Island was just almost underwater and would go through the entire next day doing repairs 24/7, and still would not be able to launch any aircraft before the next day. So that was my highlight because later on that second day, um, the ships spotted each other, and they were like within 40 nautical miles of each other. And I had just uh, recovered a strike, and the US Navy was able to actually send in those horrible short range devastators, torpedo bombers, and just wreaked havoc on my fleet. So, like the Japanese did historically, I lost at Midway, but man, that was so much fun. So much fun. So flat top, that's still one of my go-to games. All right, moving on. Wooden ships and Iron Men. This was kind of like the Air Force Dauntless of fighting sail games. So movement was plotted. It was kind of breezy, a little bit light on the details and the accuracy, but just a whole lot of fun. And you could play a game, really, really quickly. Um, we usually would play a homebrew scenario where we would um, just award each side a number of points, and you had to buy your ships and your crews. Um, and then we would just have a squadron duel basically. And I like to take the French and get some maybe average crews to keep the point cost down, and then take them up against a much smaller, expensive British fleet of crack sailors, and try my best to whittle them down and board their ships, and take them with swarms of Frenchmen. And yeah, that was great. This was also the game that I won a tournament in, and yeah, it was the only game I ever won a tournament in at a convention, and I think that was in 1982 or three. And yep, that was great fun. So Wood Chips and Iron Man, I still have my copy of it, and also I have a copy of most of the GMT Fighting Sale games, but I have not played any of them. And really, what it comes down to is like whenever I kind of get the idea, no, I really want to, try flying colors, and I go through and I read the rules, and they're not that hard to understand. And then it's time to actually get to grips with it and play it. I always think, you know what? I could probably, play the same scenario at wooden ships and probably enjoy it more. So I can't get the specter of wooden ships uh, out of view long enough to actually play a game of flying colors. So oh well, that's part of the problem of having too many gaming choices. All right, then we're gonna go to Panzerblitz, which this is a game I guess I just kind of grandfathered onto my list. Uh, this was one of the first games that I bought, and I played it a little bit, but not a lot. Never really got that far into it before I started just playing other things. But this game is also so integral to the development of war games, and has so many games that can point directly back to it as a influence or an inspiration, that I kind of have to put it on my list. Um, yeah, this I think was the first game I ever played. I guess that was tactical in nature. The first game with ranged combat, and then of course you have this iconic Redmond Simonson cover um, to go with it. So Panzerblitz, kind of a uh, grandfather entry. And we got two more. And here's another one that, even though I have played this quite a bit, even if I hadn't, would probably be grandfathered onto my list just because of its influence downrange. There are several World War II operational systems that trace directly back to Panzergruppe Guderian, each of which is um, seen as a classic type of system in its own right, but it got its impetus from Panzergruppe Guderian. Um, I kind of remember when this issue came out in 1976 of S&T, it caused an immediate stir, among our group, and it was almost as if we could kind of see that this game was going to be a game changer, even before it it actually was. Um, this was one of the first uses of untried units. I think what was it? Invasion America was actually the first one to have U untried units on the map and actually came out before PTG. But most most people kind of remember Panzergruppe Guderian as the first game that they played that had untried units in it. Um, this was one of the first truly asymmetrical systems where the Germans operate differently than their Soviet counterparts. So the Germans could use the early 1941 Blitzkrieg tactics. They got organizational benefits for keeping their uh, panzer divisions together and attacking together. The Germans also did not have untried units, where the Soviets, all of their units were untried. So yeah, the differences in the way the units um, interacted and fought on the same map was just a mind blower for most of us. And I will say that what I think the single biggest indicator of the classic nature of this game is the fact that if you poll a bunch of people about Panzergruppe Guderian, you'll probably end up with a 50-50 split of two groups of players who each think that one side or the other has a mortal lock and the game is imbalanced in their favor. Now, you figure if a game is completely unbalanced, everybody will pretty much say so, and they will agree on the side that it's unbalanced in favor of. But PGG, most, half of the people will tell you, oh yeah, the Germans, they have all the advantages and they're going to win every time. And then there are others that will talk about their fortified goose egg strategy and how, there's definitely a way that the Soviets can, put up a line in front of Smolensk and defend it until late enough into the game to where the Germans don't get any points for uh, other objectives that are further east of Smolensk. So, just for that reason alone, I think it stands the test of time as a classic. And finally, my last top 10 for the period is the Central Front series. Um, and this is Fifth Corps, which was the first game in the series. It was released in S&T magazine in 1979. And this is kind of a what I would call a sleeper classic. Um, there aren't a lot of people who would join me in saying that this system was one of the most innovative of the entire 20th century. But I really think it holds up to that kind of billing. The friction point concept that was introduced with this series of games was just masterful, I think. And the friction point system kind of postulates that your units on the map operate um, at full efficiency up until the time that they just don't. And then they give out because they're either out of supply or have taken losses, or in the case of artillery units, are just out of ammo and cease to be an effective unit. And doing anything, either movement or possibly combat or anything else, is what creates the friction points that add up And depending on the size of the unit, you can have anything from 3 friction points for one of the small speed bump armored cavalry units that the Americans are relying on to be the first line of defense in Germany in 1985 or so, up to 5 friction points for the big Soviet armored regiments. Most other units have 3 or 4 friction points. And so the Warsaw Pact player has this incredible onus to be able to, kind of sweep across West Germany and get to the Rhine or some major river and consolidate their gains within just a few days before, the handwriting would be on the wall that they're going to have to try and negotiate a political situation or perhaps start World War III with, large scale nukes, those sort of things. So the Soviet player is pretty much forced to move as often and as far as he can and gain friction points along the way in an effort to um, take over the territory. The Americans and the Belgians and the French and the West Germans um, can kind of sit and play defense, but but they gain their friction points because the Warsaw Pact is hammering at them, and also if they decide to move their position and improve their position, just moving troops into position adds friction points, which sets them up for possibly being a victim to a Soviet attack. And they can trade off friction points for retreats and kind of play that dance, maybe get a 3 friction point combat result and retreat 2 and take 1 friction point instead. But at the same time, by doing that, if they were lucky enough to have the Russian player take a friction point in the attack, if they retreat to ameliorate any of that, that also wipes out the friction gained by the attackers. So it's kind of a cat and mouse, uh, rob Peter to pay Paul kind of situation, and it's just fantastic. The the game had ended up having a really checkered future because after 3 of the games had come out, and there were at least 5 of them that were supposed to have been published, SPI ceased to exist, and the company that took them over, TSR, published the final 2 games of the set, but they completely changed the system. They did away with the friction points, had a completely different system of their own, although they kept the maps. Um, and so the end result was this kind of hodgepodge system. But there were enough people that were fans of the game that the fan base kind of took over. They um, fixed the few problems with the rules that there were, came up with improved order of battles that took into account information that was not available in 1979, and they also created a consolidated counter set that um, brought the original counter set or a derivative of it, but the original friction point system to all 5 games and then put them all together. And now they all exist in one big vassal module, which is just incredible to play. So you can play any of the five or all five if you want to go completely crazy and hog wild. So this is another really, really wonderful game that I will go out of my way to play whenever the opportunity presents itself. So there, in no particular order, are my top 10 games of the period 1970 to 1983. And yeah, leave comments underneath this to comment on whether you agree or disagree, or even to add a list of your own 10 that you think are better. And let's just keep the conversation going. Once again, I'd like to thank Mark Ruggiero for inspiring this video. And that's it for this episode of Stigler for the Details. And we'll see you next time.